Hello everybody, this is Classroom Chess with another video on the game of chess. And in previous videos we talked about the chessboard, we talked about the king, about the queen, about the rooks, the bishops and the knights. So we covered almost everything. The only piece left is the pawn. And as you can see, we have a full board of pieces here, and those little ones on the second row and the seventh row, they are called the pawns. Every player starts with 8 pawns, and they are small and they can't do as much as the other pieces, but once a very famous chess player said, the pawns are the soul of chess. And you'll see that as you get to understand the game more. Now, what can the pawns do? The pawns, and that's a very important thing to say, the pawn is the only piece that can only go forward. A pawn can never go backwards. All the other pieces can go forwards and backwards, so they can go forward and then return to where they came from if they want, but the pawn cannot. The pawn can only go forward. So it is important to think about it before you make a pawn move, because you can't take it back. And often it happens that you move your pawns too far forward and then they get too far in the enemy camp and then they get taken by the enemy piece, and then you feel sorry that you moved your pawn too far forward. And as I said, once you do that, you cannot take them back. So that's an important thing to know about the pawn. Let's see how the pawn moves. The pawn moves only in a straight line. So let's take the pawn in front of the king, the pawn on e2. The pawn on e2 can move either 2 squares to e4 or 1 square to e3. And that is your choice. You can decide if you want to move your king, your pawn in front of your king 2 squares or only 1 square. But once you moved it, it can only move 1 square. So for example, if you move your pawn to e4 and it's your move again, then you can move your pawn to e5 if you want, but not to e6. So the option to move 2 squares is only with the pawn on its original square. So you can, let's take the pawn on b2 for example. Pawn on b2 can go on the first move to b3 or to b4. But once you play the pawn, for example, to b3, from then on it can only move 1 square to b4 in this case, and then to b5 and then to b6. So that's important about the pawn. There's one more thing you need to know about the pawn, is that it moves straight. So we saw the e pawn moves to e3, e4, e5, e6. But when it captures another piece, it moves across. So that is strange about the pawn. So let's give an example from this position. Let's say white starts the game. White always starts the game, so he plays the pawn from e2 to e4, and let's say black plays the same move, e7 to e5. Now it's white move, and white can now not move the pawn from e4 to e5 and take the black pawn, because the pawn goes straight, but when it captures it has to go across. So the pawn on e4 is at the moment is blocked. It cannot go to e5 because there's another piece there, so it cannot move. So let's make another move for white. Let's move the pawn from g2 to g3. Now it's black's move. Let's assume that black plays the move pawn d7 to d5. He chooses to move the pawn 2 squares, which is allowed on the first move. But now white's e-pawn can make a move, because as I said, the pawn moves straight but captures across. So in this case, the pawn on e4 can capture the pawn on d5. So it goes across and takes away the pawn on d5 from the board. So that's important to remember. The pawn walks straight but can only capture across. So that's something to practice, and that's something we'll see more in future videos. We'll see that happening more and more. And you have 8 pawns, so 8 possibilities to move your pawn up the board. But that's very important to remember. They cannot go backwards and they move straight, but when they take something, they can only take it across. They cannot take something which is straight in front of them. Now we've covered all the pieces. Now you know enough to play a game of chess. And that's what we'll do in the next video. We'll play our first game of chess, and then we'll cover the purpose of the game, because the purpose of the game is not to capture all your opponent's men. The purpose of the game is to capture your opponent's king. It doesn't matter if you lose all your pieces, as long as you get your opponent's king, then you won the game. And we'll see that in the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.